Network.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thanks for coming. My name is Spencer Tokemeyer, and I'm the head brewer of Oasis Texas Brewing Company in Austin, Texas. As he mentioned, I'm here with Kirby Kirkconnell, our lead brewer, and Hamilton Stewart, who's our distribution manager. And we're here to tell you a little bit about session beers, why we make session beers, what is a session beer. We're going to dispel some common myths about session beers, and we're going to drink some session beer, thankfully. So right now, what you're drinking is the London Homesick Ale, and if you don't have your glass filled, raise your hand so that we can get you a pour. But this is sort of our most iconic, most sort of recognizable beer. This beer is an English-style best bitter, so it sits in that mid category between ESB and ordinary bitter. It's kind of an underrepresented style in America, but something that we picked early on. For a number of reasons. We always have really admired the English and the Germans and various others for that matter, but the English especially for their ability to pack a lot of flavor and a lot of really beautiful nuance into a small alcohol package. And that's precisely what we aim to do with London Homesick Ale, is produce a really dry, really drinkable, really flavorful beer that only drinks at 4.9% alcohol. So what you're tasting is mostly English ingredients, a lot of floor malted Marisod or barley. It's balanced really nicely with a lot of UK Challenger hops, which lend a lot of earthy, sort of herbal, black tea characteristics to it. Like I said, it's 4.9% alcohol and only 27 IBU. You'll notice it's quite dry and quite crisp. We tend to make very dry, very hop-forward beers, so even though this is not typically what you would consider hop-forward by American standards, it's not citrusy and it's not grapefruity and things like that. It's still quite a hoppy beer. In fact, it has the largest kettle hop load of any of our core beers. So it's quite a nice beer, nice balance between malt and hops, and it happened to win a gold medal at the 2014 GABF for the best bitter category, so that's pretty cool as well. So we're pretty happy about that. But woo! Anyway, so you're here to hear about session beers and a little bit about why we chose session beers. We started out 3 years ago, 2014, and we I'm sure that you're familiar with today's beer culture. You sort of have to pick a lane, or you don't have to, but it really helps you if you are known for something or you do something very well. And our lane that we chose was session beers, and there's a number of reasons for that, but the main one is, like I said, about the English, and the same applies for a lot of German beers and a lot of Czech beers and things like that as well, is that we always admired their ability to pack a lot of nuance and a lot of flavor into a small package. I always, and when Kirby and I were really developing the recipes, a lot of what we talked about was our admiration for how much more skill we felt like it took to pack a lot of flavor into a small beer rather than just, hop load and Imperial IPA and stuff like that. And I should say this right now, none of what we say here is meant to disparage any of the Imperial IPAs that you're having out there. Let's get it straight. Pliny the Elder is a fantastic beer, and nobody would ever want to disparage that. We just happen to really enjoy session beers as well, and we really want to sort of extol their virtues. And so we enjoy all beers. We just happen to enjoy session beers more often. And so that's kind of where we're coming from. That's where we started, and we've been doing it for about 3 years now. We have 4 core beers, session beers, and we're going to taste 3 of those today. And so we'll sort of guide you through those and talk a little bit more about what a session beer is.
We also want to make it very clear that when you're having beer in England, when you're having beer in Germany, session beer over there is called beer. We call it session beer up here because we've had an obsession with, because we've been for a long time under the gun of very bland beer for so long. We've gone very extreme, and we've gone very big beer. And so for us, we have to make a category for a beer that's very average, very normal everywhere else in the world, and we call it session, when everywhere else in the world calls it normal. It is beer everywhere else in the world. It is only session beer here. And we're trying to normalize that back down and trying to do something that is very much beer everywhere else. We're not thinking outside the box. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're just making beer. And in the US, it's something that unfortunately has to be categorized as session, which has come across a lot of times as lesser in flavor, lesser in aroma, lesser in everything, right? Alcohol. So you get the smallest of the package. You get the least amount of everything, and that's not true. It is everywhere else in the world. It's just beer. It is, and big beers are great and they're important, because they're very special. And the way you keep them special is you have them for special occasions. You use them during big events, your Christmas times, your weddings, your anniversaries. That's when big beers were very important historically around the world, and that's why they were made. But majority of the world drank smaller beers on a day-to-day basis because people like drinking a lot of beer versus a small amount of really big beer, you know? So we're trying to bring that back in some quantitative amount. Obviously, people like big beers, but we like to drink a lot of really good beer, and so we want to still have our wits about us and still be able to enjoy it.
We like to be able to have a couple when we get home and still be a good husband, a good father, and all that, you know. So
can I have a six-pack and still be all right?
That's right. So anyway, so what is a session beer? That's one of the things that we're here to cover is, you know, we hear the term all the time, you know, and a lot of people want us to be able to draw it into some neat box of alcohol percentage or anything like that, and we don't really tend to do that. I mean, some people will categorize it as below 5%, or some people will categorize it as, you know, under a certain IBU threshold. For us, really, it's a beer that tends to be dry, drinkable, and something that you can have more than one of while still feeling, you know, like you got your wits about you. We intend to make beers that are social, that can be shared, that can be, you know, that's sort of the origin of the term, is being able to have more than one beer in a session. So sometimes it's a little easier to look at what a session beer is not. And so what a session beer is not to us is it's not a halfway version of your other beer. You know, so you don't just take your IPA and you cut your IPA grain bill in half, and then all of a sudden you've got a session IPA. It's not really kind of it doesn't really quite work that way. And we learned that early on, that it's not so simple as to just take something that was designed to be a big beer, cut it in half, and all of a sudden you've got a great session IPA. Everything that we do from a session beer's perspective is built from the ground up to be a session beer, and we deliberately use ingredients, techniques, and everything that we do from a fermentation perspective as well is intended to design a session beer specifically. It's supposed to stand on its own. It's its own beer. It's not a half IPA. It's not any of those other things. It's also going to be something that, like I said, is meant to be had on a social level, and something that's going to be your everyday beer. We want it to be something that's sort of like a beer comfort food. It's your go-to beer. It's your day-to-day beer. There's no higher compliment really that somebody could pay us than they say. Not that they traded for our beer across the country and they had to spend X amount of millions of dollars to get it, you know, and they had to find some special beer to trade for it. No, I'd much rather hear somebody say, I have a pint of your beer every single day when I go to my neighborhood bar. I mean, that's a much higher compliment to me, and it's not meant to disparage, you know, beers that are of limited quantity or rarity or anything like that. It's just, I think there's really something to be said for that day-to-day routine, consistent, social, drinkable, dry, beautiful beers that just show a lot of nuance and show a lot of thought and care put into them. And that's what we aim to do. So that's really what a session beer is to us, is something that's social, that's drinkable, and that you can have every day, and that just stands the test of time. So with that, I think we're going to introduce Lucchesa, which is our lager beer. So we're going to go from England to Germany here. Yes, perfect. Thank you. So Lucchesa is our German-style Keller Pilsner. So Keller beer is beer served from the Keller, Keller meaning cellar in German. And so it's meant to mimic or meant to be the beer that you would have straight out of the cellar. So this is like the beer that you would taste straight from the lagering tanks in Germany or the Czech Republic. So this is true with all of our beers. We don't filter. And so this is a naturally conditioned beer. It's bright. As you can see, it's quite clear, but it all comes from natural settling. We tend to turn this beer out in about 30 to 35 days, which is a lot faster, a lot younger than pardon me, a lot younger than most traditional German Pilsners would be served, and we do that deliberately. We've always really admired, and I think it really fits the session mold, we've always really admired the green, really raw hop character, the really nice fermentation characteristics that are left over after a really fresh lager fermentation. And being able to serve it at about 30 to 35 days, we can get a really nice clarity, really sort of a really nice unfiltered look to it, but it still has a lot of that really green lager character to it, a lot of that really nice fermentation-derived character, and a lot of graininess that sort of dissipates over time with sort of the polishing effect that lagering gives. So from time to time, we'll make more traditional lagers as well. We'll do some full, 6-week lagerings and stuff like that. But for our day-to-day German-style Keller Pilsner, it was pretty important to us to have a really raw, really robust, robust lager, and that's what you're drinking right now.
And part of that is that we've gone with, so if you look at it, Best Bitters is one of the British style beers. It's the most consumed. It's the most everyday, one of the most everydays. Outside of Ordinary, it is one of the most everydays. It's the most showcase of the everyday beers. Lucchesa being a Keller Pils, being very young, being something that the industry is what would drink, right? If you are brewing and you're every day in the industry, you're drinking more Keller beer than you are drinking refined old lagers that have been aged and to perfection and put out on the market. Most brewers, most industry people in Germany aren't drinking that beer. They're drinking this beer. They're drinking a lager that has a little bit of sulfur in it. It's got a little bit of haze sometimes to it. It's got some umami, some depth, some really sharp hop character to it, a little bit of bite. It's completely different. It's very different than what you've been conditioned to think is a lager is supposed to be, right? A lager is supposed to be very round and very aged and very old, not to be disparaging of old, but it's this is much more young and raw, and it's what the people in the industry drink. If you're making lagers on a regular basis, you have probably about 70% this type of beer versus 30% of finished lager. By the time the lager is finished, that's going out to market. You're not having that anymore. You've already had a lot of the cellar stuff, and this is what we wanted to convey to people. We wanted to get this beer out to people because this is what we drink, and it's what we've drunk, what we've had in the industry for a long time, and a lot of people don't get to experience that, and it's unfortunate because it's beautiful. A lot of people think it's unfinished, it's young, it's green, and in fact, there's beauty in that. There's a lot of beauty in a lot of different stages of fermentation and lagering and aging, and for us, this was where this needed to be and what we wanted you guys to experience. And to us, this is what this beer should be at its prime for us. We love it young. We love that green character to it, that sharp bite, a little bit of sulfur in the residual flavor, and it reminds you of what it is like to actually work in a brewery, what it is to actually have that beer and process and enjoy that part of it, not the just show up and you see grain and then you see a finished product. This is one of those in-between things that it's perfectly fine to serve in between, but isn't done on a regular basis because most breweries can get higher profit over the longer age and that more refined thing. It's an easier sell to people. But for us, this is beautiful. This is like perfect for us.
Brewers are very fortunate to get to drink beer out of the Bright Tank every day, and so as best we can, we're trying to bring the beauty of the Bright Tank to your refrigerator. So not everybody, unfortunately, can sit in front of the Bright Tank at the end of the day, but we'd like to try to, as best we can, bring that to you. So that's kind of the idea of what we're going for here. And so, so as I mentioned before, there's some fairly common myths that surround session beer and what it is and what it isn't, and there's a couple of those that we'd like to cover right now. And I'll touch on one that we kind of briefly mentioned at the beginning earlier, which is that a session beer is just sort of like a half-assed attempt to like cut in half your normal IPA recipe, and that's just not quite true. And it's only become more and more apparent to us the longer we've done this that to create a good session beer, it really must be something that was built from the ground up to stand on its own 2 feet, not just be a cut in half version of your normal IPA. So obviously, there's so many things at the brewer's disposal to make a beer what it is, and we try when we're creating a session beer to manipulate every single characteristic to enhance what the session beer is. So, for example, a lot of people will sort of accuse session beers of being watery from time to time, or thin, or not, or lacking in body and stuff like that. And so, we want session beers to be dry. We want our beers to be dry. We aim to really never make a sweet beer. In fact, I don't think that we've ever set out in our entire lives to make a sweet beer. There are certain people that might like sweet beers. They're just going to have to probably go to another brewery because it's not going to be ours. That being said, that doesn't mean that it has to be thin or watery. Like we said, we utilize a lot of different techniques. For example, we'll mash at different temperatures, or we'll employ step mashing or a decoction mashing. We employ a lot of different old school sort of mashing techniques. We also add, like I said, we create a lot of hop forward beers, and so we use a lot of creative hopping techniques that give, actually via the heavy oil content of the hops, that give a slickness and a certain body from a lot of high oil hops, and we're able usually to achieve a lot of perception of body without sweetness, and so the point of that is, I guess that. It's not just a cut in half version of because we've all worked at breweries that have made full strength IPAs and everything like that, but we had to sort of break away from that and actually design these beers from the ground up and make them stand on their own 2 feet, because it's not just an afterthought to make a session beer. It's not just a thing that you're doing because well, we've already got this other IPA recipe. We might as well just throw a session beer out there too. Just cut it in half and throw out a session beer. Now it's some thought, and there's a very deliberate way that we try to go about it, and I think that we've been able to manipulate a lot of different techniques, especially to really help our beers sort of stand on their own 2 feet and be a beer unto themselves. Because like Kirby said, in the rest of the world, it's just beer. You know, it's not session in the rest of the world. A German Pilsner is not session German Pilsner in Germany. It's just Pils. You know, so we try hard to do everything that we can to make sure that every beer is its own entity and it stands on its own 2 feet. It's not just a cut in half version of something else. Another myth that we often get is, hey dude, I thought session beers were just a fad, man. And so we're here to kind of try to dispel that rumor as well. As you know, they're very popular these days, session beers, and we obviously you see a lot of people making session IPAs, sessionized versions of various larger styles and everything like that. But you know, like Kirby mentioned earlier, these beers have been a lot of these beers are either classic styles or sort of iterations or riffs on classic styles. You know, session IPA is really just, you know, many different iterations of, you know, a classic English beer, and so we're here to try to, you know, keep people aware of, no, it's not just a fad, and we're not just doing it to try to ride, you know, a wave or anything like that. We really want session beers to be a part of people's lexicon and just sort of their beer daily life. And we really feel like these styles have stood the test of time and can continue to stand the test of time, and that's really what we're going for.
Well, it just simply is that if you're in the industry, I don't know how many people are in the industry that are here. Okay. Have you ever set off a lab report for White Labs or Y East or anything? Have you ever set off a lab report and got results for the average beer in the United States? I'll let you know. We sent off a lab report for our session IPA to get some, because they were doing the roundup and you get some free, you know, we're not doing this every day. There was a discount. We send off a lab report to get a lab report back. Average IPA in the United States, what do you think ABV is? Can I get a couple yells out? 7.5. Average IPA in the United States is 7.5%. The true average IPA probably back in the day, maybe 6%, maybe. That was a big beer back then. So session IPA, we're doing 4.5%. I know that's smaller than what the 6.5% would have been, or 6% would have been traditionally, but the norm is the small beer, not the big beer. And what we're trying to do is we're just trying to do what was traditionally the norm and scaling up from there. If we do big beers, don't get us wrong, we love big beers. We love enjoying them, but they are for special occasions, and we do them for that. There's always anniversary beers, there's always Christmas beers, there's always that special occasion beer you want to put out, or some barrel-aged something that you want to put out, and that's beautiful, and we love them, and we do them as well. But we wanted to specialize in, unfortunately, we had to pick up the session category because in the United States, we are considered a session brewery because we make small beers. But small beers to us are the average, is the norm. I mean, that's what people, that should be what your normal beers should be, right? And then you scale up from there.
Yep.
But we've trended a little bit to the big side. And so everything, if you put out something that's norm, a lot of times nowadays is considered session. And we're trying to get away with that because people automatically now you're identifying session with being a watered down version, a lesser of what you have, something that's a negative, and it's not that way. A session isn't a negative, it's the standard. And the bigger beers are a plus on top of that. So session beers shouldn't be looked at as a negative. Because you like big beers doesn't mean you have to hate session beers. It just means there's certain beers for certain occasions, and you have to get that in your mindset, pretty much.
So I was just informed that we're running a little low on time, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Metamodern and then open it up to a little Q&A. Metamodern is our best-selling beer. It's our session IPA, 4.5% alcohol, 45 IBU. Like I said earlier about the manipulating of the oil and how we use hops. We use hops in some pretty interesting ways in this beer. We don't use any traditional bittering additions whatsoever. We really backload the kettle to get a lot of high oil content in this beer. As you'll see, it's not nearly as bright as our other beers. It tends to be quite a bit hazier than the other beers. We have a lot of hop oil haze in this beer, and we're fine with that. We're an unfiltered brewery, and we tend to make bright beers, but we're not too worried about a little bit of oil haze. In fact, we really kind of enjoy it. But this beer, we wanted it to drink super dry, super juicy, really tropical, and just keep the bitterness quite low so that it's really a day-to-day drinkable beer. After all, for God's sake, we live in Texas and it's 105 degrees half the year, so half the year at best maybe. So anyway, like I said,
we're wearing long johns right now. I want y'all to know that.
Yeah, we can't stand it.
All right, if you've got any questions, raise your hand. I got a microphone. I'll bring it right over to you. Here we go. First question.
Hi, my name's Steve, and you
Hi,
talked
Steve.
about your wanting to make dry beers, or that's kind of their path that you've chosen. Tell me a little about when you might use a decoction mash and when you might use just a lower mash temperature to achieve a dry beer.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we tend to have lower mash temperatures most of the time because like I said, we really like our beers to dry out. We don't tend to like to have a lot of residual sweetness in our beers, and I think the styles that we produce sort of lend themselves to being sort of crisper, drier styles to begin with. But to speak to decoction specifically, we tend to utilize that more specifically on lager styles where it's a little more traditional. But we do that to both enhance sort of the dryness of the beer, but we also want to enhance that sort of melanoidin character. And so specifically we'll do that on some of our we do it on the Lucchesa, but we also will do it on like the Fest beer. We'll do some really long decoctions that will really enhance that malt and melanoidin character. But still, the goal always being to dry it out, though. So
And you have to remember, a lot of times those small beers like that, some things that are dry tend to be you're using a very simple malt bill, especially if you're doing a traditional German beers. You're using very simple malt bills, and what you need to do is to give more character to those malt bills. There's more processes versus grains, and so you use a very simple amount of grains, 2 or 3 grains at the most. But the process to actually produce it is much more in depth. You're doing step mashing, you're doing decoction. Those add layers of flavor that come through in the beer, although very subtly, because it is, after all, German beer, so very subtle, very strict, and very within rules. But you still want to add those layers of flavor, because even on a simple beer, just because it's a simple beer doesn't mean you just have to ignore all the complexity of what a simple beer can deliver. You have to go through those steps, because even if people don't necessarily get those nuances exist, and you have to put in the labor and the effort into getting those nuances because they make a difference. There are people who do, there's a bell curve, and there are people who do identify those, and that's who we're brewing for. And the majority of the people taste it and they say this is a great beer, but they don't know why. And so there are very few people who do understand why, and those are the people you brew those, you do those complex processes for. And then everybody else just thinks, man, this is a really good lager. I don't know why. It's really good.
Does that answer your question? Okay, cheers. Cheers to you as well.
Yeah.
All right. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have tonight, guys. Thanks for sharing your beer with us. Can we get a round of applause for our Texas brewers?
Thank you, guys.
All right, we got another panel coming up soon, in just about 30 minutes, and we're doing them all night. So if you go out and have some more beer and you get tired, come back and join us. Thanks again to our panelists today.
The Brewing Network.